Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today on our webcast. My name is Dina Evans. I'm the Marketing and Special Events Manager here at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. Today's presentation is part 2 of our 4-part series, the CSO series on building successful threat intelligence programs. Today's session will focus on starting a program. And your LookingGlass presenter for today's session is Alan Thompson, who's our Chief Technology Officer. But before we get started, I just wanted to run through a very few quick housekeeping items through the BrightTalk webinar platform. Please make note on the right side of your screen, there should be some menu tabs. There is a chat feature, which is located there. Please feel free, send us any questions that you might have that you would like Alan to address during his session today. All of our audience members are muted, so if you have any questions at all, please be sure to enter them through that screen because you won't have any audio to directly ask the presenter. At the end of the session, we'll try to address all the questions. We'll kind of hold off till then. But if we happen to run out of time to address all the questions, we'll be sure to contact you directly following the presentation. So if we get way too many, don't fret. We'll still contact you directly to make sure they're all addressed. Also, please make sure that you guys understand that chat feature only addresses us on the presenter side. So the audience cannot see whatever question is that you are submitting. So feel free, if you have any private concerns, anything that you want just to address directly, just note it as such and we'll contact you to make sure they get answered. There's also an attachments and links section to the right of your screen. Feel free to peruse those items whenever you have a few minutes. But for now, so without any further delay, let me go ahead and pass this over to Alan, who will kick off today's webcast. Alan?
Thanks, Dina. Welcome, everybody. Really appreciate you taking the time to dial in and listen into our second part of our webinar series. One of the things that we covered in the first part of the webinar series was really put in context what it means to build an intelligence program. And there's many aspects of that. In part 1, we covered what are some of the requirements that organizations should look for to really drive what their program is doing. And in this part of the series, we will start to take those requirements and start to look at, okay, what do I do next? You know, what should I do? What should I focus on from those requirements to start building a program framework? And I just want to reemphasize something right up front. An intelligence program really depends a lot on the organization that it's supporting and some of the key challenges that organization is dealing with in terms of risk that they face. And so we are describing a framework and best practices, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those are all of the aspects you need to consider. And certainly, if your organization has a specific need, there may be elements of a program that exists in your environment that would not necessarily exist in other organizations that have a completely different risk profile. So I want to, keep that in mind as we go through. We're talking about, a good set of common principles that should apply to all programs. But if you do have any specific questions about the framework and how it would apply to your environment, please feel free to ask questions, as Dina said, in the chat or follow up in subsequent emails. So one of the things that we covered in the prior webinar series was really the requirements. And a lot of requirements are oftentimes, when you talk to people who are, say, in a SecOps environment versus an analyst who's doing malware analysis, they would describe requirements in terms of technology. And a lot of customers who are maybe feel the need that intelligence program can be introduced in the environment, they maybe say, okay, I want to reduce risk and I want to understand how an intelligence-driven security profile can help me protect my organization. And so those terms are not necessarily directly connected to technology terms. There has to be a connection from the organization business terms into technology. And so where do you start by taking those business terms and start mapping it to things that make sense? So one of the things that we're going to do in this webinar sequence is describe two different types of categories of an Intel program. Now, most organizations typically have both things that they want to protect of their own, so their own systems, their own applications, their people, their brand, etc. But they also rely on third parties and supply chain. And the most recent, latest news flash around where some malware, ransomware has been distributed potentially as part of a supply chain of an application. That's just an example, a latest example of where supply chain and third party are really critical. We're going to use these examples, the categories of Intel programs, to really explain what should be focused on in each aspect. But consider that most organizations will typically have both, but it helps us explain it. So the first thing is starting with a baseline. There's three key parts to understanding what you have and how to complement it with an Intel program. The first thing is, and we've seen this with many organizations, where they literally take a list of all of their capabilities in terms of tools and systems, and they build out a spreadsheet to help understand, okay, what is everything that we have today that potentially is either part of our security infrastructure or potentially could be leveraged as part of Intel. The other aspect is expertise and skills. Now, those may seem like they're the same thing, but they're subtly different. Knowledge is something that is oftentimes gained with wisdom and expertise and insight. And the knowledge you require to build out your Intel program may not be on hand. You may never have done that before. And so what are some of the things you need to look for when you're building the framework? And we'll discuss some of that in subsequent slides. The other part of that key point of understanding the baseline is around skills. So as you operationalize your intelligence program, the day-to-day operation needs, you have people who are already on staff. Do they have the right skill set to operationalize your Intel program? And taking an inventory of what those skills are, what certifications do they have? Do they know how to, collect data? Do they know how to analyze data? Do they know how to use systems that may use that? All of those aspects are, day-to-day skill levels that you need to understand where you're starting from, because it will ultimately inform what framework you build. And that's the key reason for starting with a baseline. And then the final part is time. Most organizations will say, okay, I absolutely need an Intel program, but do you actually have the time to develop an Intel program yourself? Or do you need it tomorrow and you need somebody who has both the expertise and skills to operationalize it? And so you may have some tools, you may have some expertise and some skills, but time depends on whether you can execute all of that together. And so starting with a good understanding what your program builds from is important. A key part of an Intel program framework is around data. And one of the key things that a lot of people tend to fixate on is potentially aspects of the data. But it's more than just aspects of the data. It's also how the data is processed, how it comes through the pipeline, ultimately to what results you're looking for. So based on requirements, you may be looking for specific aspects of our outcomes. And so do you have the raw data collection capability, or does your Intel program have the raw collection capability to even provide insight into that? One of the key things you need to keep in mind is you're potentially casting the net very far and broad. You're refining it down to what ultimately is a very small number of things that you need to act on. If you don't have necessarily the right processes and the right people, etc., you're not necessarily going to be able to get to that small number of actionable things. And so as you start to understand the requirements, you can start to understand the data that you need to collect, the systems that need to exist, and the people that potentially are operating that going forward. Another key part of an Intel framework is really understanding what is the steady state of collection and what is what are anomalies that potentially can happen over the course of time. So your steady state may be in this, screenshot. We're talking about 1.5 million raw events per day, and that through a sequence of refinement gets reduced to a smaller number of potential incidents that need to be understood and acted upon. But what if though that changes over time? What if the number of information incidents starts to increase significantly? What if it starts to increase or decrease significantly? Understanding those anomalies and being able to have a framework in place to be able to understand those anomalies is really important to improving the accuracy of your program as well as the robustness of your solution. So don't just consider what data, but also aspects of the data and how you measure the data as part of your framework so that you can deal with anomalies as they occur. Now, some of the anomalies may be related to you're just getting a new data feed that has a lot more raw data. But a lot of the time you should be looking at the raw data from what context it provides. So one of the common things that many actors take advantage of are the vulnerabilities that exist in existing software and systems. Do you have the intel that provides you that information? So monitoring what vulnerabilities are out there, what those vulnerabilities apply to systems that you are protecting or are making sure are protected. Is there malware or systems intel feeds that are providing information that takes advantage of those vulnerabilities or exploits? So the greater the context you get from your intel, the more actionable it will be. And so I can't stress that enough, that as you build out your framework, you really need to be looking at not just volume of data, but quality of data. And that necessarily also introduces another aspect, which is the coverage of the data. So if your requirement is that you need to monitor social media because you're concerned about potentially a hacktivist who is doing both a cyber attack as well as potentially a physical attack, say a site that you physically own, are those things, do you have the data to cover that? Do you have the ability to monitor both aspects? There may be a lot of activity that's taking place in the dark web where actors are communicating about the latest malware approaches, they're selling their capabilities to others. There's a lot of insight that you can gain about potentially attacks in the future that occur in those forums. And if you're not necessarily monitoring that, it's going to be impacting your future ability to respond. And then finally, timeliness of the data. So oftentimes there may be capabilities that are described many months ahead of time that are taking advantage of vulnerabilities. But when an attack actually occurs, having real-time updates on which sites are actually infected, which sites are being used as attack infrastructure, what techniques are in action right now is really important. So consider not just real-timeness of the data, but also the longer-term aspects of monitoring those approaches. So one of the key things is what do you want to monitor? And as you build out your framework, you really need to consider what sources you're looking at. This is just an example here, but there are potentially many, many different sources of data you need to be looking at. And that is a key part of building out a robust framework. The other part is of the data coming from that source, what are you looking for in that data? So what is the data elements in the data? And oftentimes you might think, like if I do a Google search, I'm looking for a string. But imagine if you're looking for something that's related to, say, a brand or a copyright statement. Is there specific aspects of that data that goes beyond simple string searching? And so consider as part of your framework, can you differentiate between all of those different aspects of data that make it more tangible what is being communicated in the intelligence? Another aspect of the intelligence is really looking at the classification of the data itself. So oftentimes there's different aspects of malware out there. There's malware that may be attacking IoT devices, such as, like, for example, the Mirai botnet. There may be malware that attacks certain specific control infrastructure, electrical systems, certain sites that run a common version of, say, WordPress. You name it. There's different types of attacks out there, and they can be classified by many vendors. They often characterize this as this type of malware. That helps you define the framework that you need to put in place. So if you care about a particular type of malware or a classification of malware over another, then those are aspects that you need to consider as part of your program framework and prioritize them as you build out the program itself. Now, one of the things that I've mentioned in previous slides, and I will reiterate here, is this concept of what you're looking for. So what data are you looking for? What terms or what aspects of the data you're looking for? What are the actual number of data mentions or the data instances that are matching those terms? What data has been vetted from that? So of all of the spectrum of data that I'm collecting from all of the sources, what aspects have I found in that data? Have I been able to reduce it down by both machine and potentially humans? And ultimately, what is the number that needs to be acted on that truly is something of intelligence value? Now, intelligence value is a subjective term that is based on your requirements and what your organization needs to be focused on. But all of these key terms that I'm describing on the screen here are important to understand as you develop your framework. So, for example, when you develop your framework, do you have a good set of target terms that you're looking for in the data that would be collected? Do you have the processing capability to vet the information to reduce it into a number of incidents? Do you have a taxonomy and a process to handle the incidents once you have that reduced number? These are key things that you need to include in your framework. Another key part of a framework is that, unfortunately, most attacks are not as simple as just a single event, a single discrete event. Oftentimes, most advanced attacks are actually multifaceted. They potentially may use different aspects to exploit their target. They may use an approach where they DDoS something before they then try something else to exploit that target that is being DDoSed. And your ability in your Intel framework to correlate those discrete events across them and then determine that, hey, I'm seeing from this actor or this source that I believe is an actor, it's a coordinated sequence of events across these individual Intel sources. The ability to correlate that and identify that as a coordinated attack against, say, something you are protecting is really important to be built into your framework. And without that, I can't stress enough that what will end up happening is you will end up being swamped by just literally lots and lots of individual discrete events that will make it really hard to respond because there'll be so much data that you won't be able to see a pattern effectively. And patterns and behavioral aspects of correlation can be both human. There's a lot of buzz out there in the industry about machine learning and ability to identify that type of data. And some of those, some are legitimate, some are mostly hype. But the other key thing is be able to use the machine to then pass information to a human being who does have expertise to be able to see, potentially based on experience or knowledge, they're able to bring together facts that a machine sadly may not be able to identify. Another part of protecting your own organization is really the footprint. And most large organizations do this pretty well, but it's a constant challenge. That's the other thing that is that this is not a one-time deal. So your Intel framework, how connected is it to the other systems in your security infrastructure that has an inventory of all of your computer systems that are in the organization? What network points of presence to the internet do you have? What ownership information do you have? What domains do you have? All of this information is pertinent system footprinting that is used as a basis for then, as you gather intel, you can say, okay, what systems is this intel relating to? Is it something that I should care about? Is it something I should not care about? The other aspect is not just the systems that are connecting your infrastructure, but also the applications that run through those systems. So what are internal applications? What are external applications that you really care about? Most organizations typically run many different applications, and some are business critical operations and some are less so. And so if an attack, an intel source is coming in saying, okay, they're targeting exploiting a vulnerability that has been identified as part of your critical applications infrastructure, what information do you need? And having a framework to be able to gather all of that and correlate it and make it relevant to your business is really important. So I wanted to talk through an example before we get to kind of the framework that I've been describing. So this example is where we had experience with a large ISP in Central Asia, and they had a DNS infrastructure that was potentially, or not potentially, it was actually being attacked. And it was an ongoing DDoS attack. It literally impacted their business operations. As an ISP, obviously, their critical need was to maintain that infrastructure for the organizations that were using that. It impacted a broad set of organizations, and it took out a lot of the connectivity that was supporting those organizations. With Intel-driven infrastructure, we were able to stop that attack and get the DNS capability back online and avoided some of the cache poisoning that was taking place as well. And the reason why I wanted to describe this example was not to just talk about Intel, but to show its relationship to other network infrastructure and security infrastructure. So as you gather data on DDoS attacks, so I had determined that as an ISP, DDoS is oftentimes, sadly, a common attack. So what sources of information can I gather that potentially will give me insight into the different types of DDoS that take place, what infrastructure that's coming from, if that's possible to identify, and what are the things that I need to do to protect it. And then apply that to a security infrastructure in my actual DNS infrastructure to protect those servers. It was really an end-to-end case where we were able to gather intelligence and apply it directly to the network infrastructure to maintain the business operations of the ISP. So just to recap, we talked about this in the requirements webinar earlier, and it's really important to kind of keep this in mind that as you collect data, look to how you refine it into intelligence and look to understand what aspects of turning data into intelligence, all of the systems you need are important. So with that, there's a 7-part framework that we recommend. The first part is requirements, which we've talked about. Second part is who do you need to implement your framework and your program. So these would be typically the architects, the analysts, the subject matter experts you need. So who do you need based on the requirements? The third part is how are they organized? So many organizations have options where you have different organizational boundaries. You have SecOps, network operations, you have a vulnerability team, you have IT. All of these teams potentially need to be coordinated and work together. And so for your Intel program, for the key roles that that are part of the Intel program, how are they actually organized to be effective? And that's a key part of understanding the effective program. The fourth part is around what process is being applied in the program. So I gave an example earlier about the DNS real-world case where we had intelligence collected, it was vetted and refined and determined relevant to the DDoS attack. It was applied to network infrastructure. That involved a whole slew of connected data through systems to ongoing infrastructure. That process was specific to a particular attack, a network-borne attack. But there are many different other aspects of intelligence that can be applied to other aspects of your security infrastructure. And understanding what those processes are so that you can both automate as well as improve over time is really important. The fifth part is around the systems that support those processes. So what systems do you have? What do you need to invest in? It could either be you're developing it yourself, you're acquiring it from external organizations. All of these systems are important to be not just understood what you have, but also how you refine and improve them. And it's a key part of understanding your program framework. The second last part is critical around metrics and reporting. So with the Intel framework, you need to put in place how are you going to measure your program. If you do not understand what data is being useful, how that data is being turned into action that is protecting your organization, then you're blind to whether this investment is paying dividends. You know, and one of the key things is that frankly, you cannot have enough metrics on the program. And this could go to not just data, but also monitoring the effectiveness of people, the processes that are connected, you know, being used by these people. All of these aspects, measuring and be able to report on that will help improve the success of your Intel program. And that's a key part of your framework. And then finally, delivering that Intel product, whatever product that may, whether it's a report that then gets sent to the C-suite to you know, provide a summarization of an attack that occurred, who attacked you, the motives behind, or at least your understanding of the motives behind them, what they were attacking, what you did to respond to that attack, etc. Those are key things that ultimately the program you know, is going to help drive the improvement around it. So the second category of program I wanted to touch on was around supply chain and third party. And you know, I literally found this news article yesterday. I could have probably picked one that was several over the last several years, but you know, this attack is just another example, sadly, of where potentially, you know, the article discussed how some attack software was potentially used to start the attack. And, you know, I don't think anybody would necessarily question that this would be a good way to infiltrate an organization. If you can obfuscate software that looks legitimate and will ultimately be installed by somebody and then therefore give them access to the internal environment, that's potentially a very good way to do it. But you need to protect against that. And so what does your Intel program need to do to potentially consider that? We have considered these aspects and broken the third-party supply chain problem into a quadrant effect so that you can understand and assess your supply chain and your third parties in different manners. So on the vertical axis, we have the maturity of the supply chain third party itself. So do they have a very strong security program, Intel program themselves, or do they not? And on the horizontal axis is, does that supply chain third party have access or strong access to your environment? So if they are embedded in your environment and they have the keys to the kingdom, the risk to your organization if that third party or that supply chain vendor was compromised is higher than if they have small access to your system or very little access and they were compromised. So understanding these two axes of data, you know, both maturity of the external party as well as access, helps you categorize where they are in this quadrant. And then you can start to consider, okay, what common things do I need to do that applies to all of them? And a lot of these things are not new to anybody, I would imagine. But the key thing is for each quadrant, what do you need to consider in terms of your Intel framework? So that's the key thing, is that if you have a lot of vendors who are important to your organization, but they're of high maturity, but they have low risk or low access to your system, then this is the lowest risk of integration that you need to be worried about. And some of the key things you need to be looking at is doing best practices, but also assessing them more often than their contract renewed. But there's a level of trust there that may not exist with other vendors. A more moderate risk is somebody who has more access to your organization, but they have similarly mature processes in place. They may have their own intel program. They may have indicators and information that they can share with you of attacks that are being targeted at their systems and their systems that may be ultimately a knock-on to your systems. So having that sharing environment set up on a continuous basis, it will be really important. You may even consider having joint red teams, so you're using their software or their systems to potentially attack your own environment through their systems. So those types of approaches will be important, particularly if they have very close access to your systems. Another moderate approach is where the maturity of the organization is lower, but they have less access to your environment. So the Intel program potentially still is useful, and you're still monitoring them, but the approach that you're taking is more regular. And you want to encourage their maturity so that as an organization, you have certain procedures and capabilities that you want to encourage them up to the top two quadrants in terms of maturity. The final quadrant is the highest risk, and this is where a third party or supply chain has high access or is very strong impact on your organization if they're compromised. They have low maturity, and in many circumstances, this might be because the relationship with that vendor or that supply chain existed before your Intel program even existed or your secure program existed. And so you need to kind of retrofit, if you will, a lot of best practices, but also start to look at how the Intel program can improve your risk profile against those vendors or to support those vendors. So look at access control mechanisms, very strong access control mechanisms. Look at APT defense so that you can make sure that those vendors are not necessarily impacting you if they are attacked. There's some key things here. The final part on a third-party Intel program is that not just only understanding the individual organizations you have relationships with, but also understanding and monitoring segment intelligence. So understanding what attacks are taking place across other vendors that may be in your own market segment, or organizations that you think are related to your environment that may ultimately indicate an attack against that type of vendor may then be pivoted and used to attack you. So understanding and assessing what is going on across the broader universe of third-party and supply chain will help you inform your program. And so does your Intel program actually have that option? Does it have the ability to gather that data? Do you have the ability to analyze and understand that? And I think looking to the data and the systems to help provide that visibility is a critical part of building out your Intel framework. So final recommendations. So we talked about requirements in the first part of the webinar series. And we talked about the justification of the requirements, making sure that the business and the risk that the C-suite understand is being translated into concrete requirements that drive the Intel program. The second part of it is really understanding what your framework and your Intel framework needs to do. So we recommend a 7-part framework, but how much each aspect of this framework is relevant to your environment or how strong you should focus is dependent on your specific use cases. But without putting it in this framework, you may be struggling to see the connection or the dependencies. And so we recommend, by taking this approach of breaking it into a 7-part framework, you can actually start to resolve the problem of roles. So for example, you identify that you have a great planner or a great architect, but you don't necessarily have subject matter expertise in specific aspects of brand protection or physical security or malware analysis. So identifying those aspects, both from a requirement perspective, but to categorize that in your framework is going to help you structure your program. The other recommendation is think about how you can structure the program to protect both your own environment, but also your supply chain and third parties. And go through the exercise of categorizing and identifying your supply chain, your third parties, and which quadrant do they fit into. Do they have maturity? Are they, have a strong access to your assets and your protected footprint that was identified as part of the earlier slide? Clearly identifying how your supply chain and third party maps into your environment, and then using your Intel program to focus on that is going to be very helpful. And just before we get to questions, I wanted to call out that in our 3rd-part webinar series that will be happening in a few weeks, we will be talking about a lot more detail in terms of Intel program. We'll be using this framework that you see on the screen to really dig in and say, okay, what are the processes that need to exist, and giving a lot more detail than I have done in this webinar today. With that, I will pass it back to Dina to raise any questions that have been asked. Dina?
Awesome. Sure, Alan. Awesome. There's a few that have come across, so let's start with this first one. Let's see. Okay, if my organization is worried about ransomware attacks, what could an intelligence program look like to help protect against that?
Well, it's a very pertinent question. It's very top of mind. It's a lot of vendors are out there talking about understanding what ransomware is out there, how it's exploiting things. I think one of the key things to look at with an Intel program is what aspects of ransomware do you need to be concerned about? So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the first things is, okay, a lot of times the ransomware is being used to exploit a particular vulnerability. So I would suggest that start with making sure that the intelligence you're gathering is identifying what vulnerabilities are known to be being exploited, and then be able to correlate that to your environment and what systems those may impact. That's one aspect. Another part of the ransomware is, okay, what systems out there are being used to communicate once the ransomware has been, say, downloaded? Is it using a command and control infrastructure that ultimately is causing the keys to be exchanged, for example? Can you block that communication? And so what Intel sources are monitoring for that type of command and control infrastructure, and can they provide you that insight so that before infection potentially occurs, you can actually block some of that? Those are some of the other aspects. Another key aspect is really around supply chain, third-party aspects. So, for example, I talked about understanding both the risk to your own organization, but to the third party. So, if you leverage a third party that would potentially be the target of a ransomware attack, what is the impact on your organization if that third party is impacted by the ransomware? Does that third party have your data, for example? Do they have backups? Do they have necessary encryption in place so that data, both at rest as well as in motion, are taking place so that if a ransomware attack occurs on that third party, that you are going to be able to recover from that situation? So those are some of the key things that you should be looking at. It's obviously, it's a multifaceted approach, but you need to be looking at broadly across it.
Thank you, Alan. This next question that came in is very relevant to what you're just mentioning about third parties, so I think this is a great one. It says, our organization has hundreds of third parties and supply chain vendors. Where should I focus my attention on for an intelligence program protecting against threats?
So it's really one of analysis of cost benefit. You know, if you do have, obviously this question, the person is saying that they have hundreds of vendors. So I would, you know, use that matrix that I, you know, displayed earlier to potentially prioritize the vendors and the impact. And so start by, you know, understanding which vendors of the hundreds that you have, which ones are the highest risk to your organization. So if somebody who has a very close access to your environment, they have low maturity, but the impact to your business is large if they get hit, then that's a way potentially to prioritize how you monitor and how you respond to the attacks against that attack. So that's one way to kind of categorize your third parties, prioritize them based on the impact to your business, and if they were compromised. And obviously don't rest there. You know, work proactively to get them to that higher level of maturity. And you know, if it's possible to choose different vendors based on their cyber maturity and their practices, then you know you should look into that. Don't just necessarily accept that you know, we have a business partnership right now and their practices are poor. You know, there might be options in the future to be able to help influence that as a security team.
Very good points, Alan. A couple more I think we've got time for, at least this one. Let's see. Okay, we currently have a lot of intelligence, but the false positive rate is killing us. Any suggestions on our intelligence program to reduce the false positive rate?
Yeah, I mean, so false positives is a lot of time very, you know, I will say that ability to understand the context that the information that you're receiving has to other elements of the data is a key part of it. So, you know, if you get an IP address and a source, an intel source, say, okay, this IP address is bad, that's not really bad. So if you were to really push that IP address to a firewall and block it, you know, it's kind of like you're hoping that it actually is an effective rule, and sometimes it will, and sometimes, or probably a lot of the time, it won't be. And so, being able to understand, you know, what does this IP address represent? Is it attack infrastructure that's being used to distribute malware? Is it an IP address host that is no longer actually owned by anybody, and it's you know, just happens to be out there in an intel source that really isn't being used? There really depends on a lot of understanding of context. And I'll go back to the more you can footprint not just your own environment, but also potentially these intel. So be able to take an IP address, a domain, the raw pieces of intel you receive, and then look up using, you know, either, you know, if you have a tip yourself, or be able to look up these systems and say, okay, tell me everything you know about this system, not just now, but also historically, and be able to correlate all that context and then determine whether it's something to be acted on will help you reduce your false positive rate.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan. We are almost out of time. There are a couple more questions that came in, but it looks like they want more direct responses. So we will reach out to you guys directly after the webcast. Someone had also asked about sharing the slides. Yes, we will share the slides with you guys after today's presentation. They will be sent out to all of our audience members directly through email. So keep an eye out for that. But thank you so much, Alan, today for your presentation. And thank you to everyone that attended today's live webcast. Make note that there is a recording of today's webinar in a couple different places. You can either access that on our resources page on our website or through the Bright Talk, our LookingGlass Bright Talk channel where all of our webcasts are housed. So feel free to share that presentation with your colleagues, or if you came in late, you can go back and hear the rest of the recording. And don't forget, please make sure to sign up for part 3 of our CSO series on building a successful threat intelligence program. The next one is on July 12th, and it will focus on key elements. In this final screen that Alan has up, it does show different ways that you can reach us. It has our social media access as well as our website, and also through the attachments and link part here on Bright Talk. There's a place there you can go direct to our site or the Contact Us page. If you have any additional questions, please feel free, reach out to us directly to either Alan. He can be reached through the website, or you can go straight to our sales department if you'd like to set up any kind of demo. But please be sure and join us for the next part. Again, this is a 4-part series, so we'd love to have everybody back. And again, Alan, thank you so much for your time today. Great content, and we appreciate everything that you do.
Thank you, Dina, and thank you for everybody attending. Really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
Fantastic, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for attending.